Welcome to the Produce Moms Podcast, where we believe there is a produce mom in all of us. I'm Lori Taylor, founder and CEO of the Produce Moms. For 10 years, I sold fresh produce to over 300 grocery stores in the U.S. And today, my team and I are fully focused on inspiring people to eat more fruits and vegetables. This show is just one of the ways that we hope to inspire you and your family to eat more produce and live a better life. If you like what you're hearing on the podcast, join our community of almost 40,000 in all 50 states and over 30 countries by visiting theproducemoms.com/subscribe. And be sure to subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes. Thanks for being here. Enjoy today's show. Welcome back, everyone. Today on the Produce Moms Podcast, we are actually welcoming back a repeat guest. We are welcoming Beth Bechdol. For those of you that have been with us since 2018 on the Produce Moms Podcast, or for those of you that want to scroll back in the archives, you can find Beth's first episode with the Produce Moms on episode 28. So it's wonderful to welcome Beth back to the show today. Here we are in 2020. Beth is doing new and exciting things, and she's really making a huge impact with her new role. Beth is at the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is also known as FAO, and she is the Deputy Director General. The FAO is an organization of the United Nations. It's a specialized agency that leads international efforts to defeat hunger and improve nutrition and food security. We're talking about some of the most critical work within humanity, and most definitely within agriculture. So Beth, welcome back.
Thank you. And Lori, I have to say congratulations to you on how many more successful podcasts you've been able to do since that episode in the 20s. It's great to see the success of your show. And I followed you from Indiana to Rome, and I'm glad we're getting a chance to connect again today.
I am too. And I look forward to the day, Beth, where you and I could stroll through the streets of Rome together and I can travel and we can hug each other, and we're looking forward to that. But we're going to talk about the disrupted society today and what the pandemic has changed as it relates to food security. And before we get into that, though, please introduce yourself to our guests, those who aren't familiar with your story, and tell us more about the FAO and what you do.
Sure. So I came here to Rome in early March, and I'll share a little bit more about my role and some of the work that we do at FAO. But for me personally, this is really the culmination of kind of two really interesting chapters, I think, in my personal and sort of professional journey. It really has demonstrated to me sort of the things sometimes, as they say, stars align in really interesting ways, because the start of my career out of grad school was 10 years of time in Washington, D.C. I did my undergraduate work at Georgetown in the School of Foreign Service, and actually at one time did aspire to being a career diplomat myself. Maybe in some warm tropical Caribbean country would have been nice. But I always had this passion for international relations and global studies and the world. And then agriculture entered that. Growing up on a farm in Indiana, understanding the importance of agriculture to the international world. And so I had spent about 10 years in DC at USDA on the Hill, really kind of focused on policy and trade. And then I can't remember if I shared this with you earlier, but my husband and I, our daughter, left Washington. We had personal ties to Indiana, family reasons to come back. And so we sort of hung up the chapter in DC, came back to Indiana, and sort of restarted careers, kind of got involved and got engaged in different things. And I got this opportunity to be really on the ground floor of building a new concept around an AgTech, AgBio science ecosystem in the state of Indiana, all focused around economic development. How do you really elevate technology and entrepreneurship and promote young next generation talent, all in this field of food and agricultural innovation? And for me, it was this incredibly exciting, this really just sort of inspiring, creative time where I think I realized that I had a little bit of an entrepreneur, in me, as opposed to maybe more of that sort of Washington D.C. again political or diplomatic space. And what I'm finding now is coming here to Rome, coming to the FAO and taking over this role is letting me put those two worlds together. FAO is a very large organization. We're very complex. We're pretty bureaucratic, but we also are recognizing that for our work to be done well at the global level, you mentioned hunger and food insecurity, nutrition, and all of these big challenges, it's going to take some entrepreneurship. It's going to take some creativity. It's going to take some nimbleness. And again, technology and innovation are going to play a huge role in that for us going forward. And so, while it's a huge challenge, I actually do feel pretty well prepared. There's still a ton to learn, a lot about my colleagues, about our work, about our scope and our programs worldwide that I know I still have ahead of me, but it's a really great opportunity to sort of bridge those two chapters and bring it all here to this current leadership role that I have.
Oh, that's so good. And I will say, as a lifelong Hoosier myself and someone who's obviously very passionate and has built a career out of serving the agriculture industry, Beth, you have made a lasting impact and legacy through what you did in Indiana with AgriNovus Indiana, and really helped put our home state on the map as it relates to agriculture leadership. So thanks again for all that hard work. And it is a legacy. It lives on today, despite you moving on and serving the world now. I'm just so proud of you. And this is going to be great. So tell us more about what you're specifically doing at FAO.
Yeah, so let me maybe just say you described us well. We are 75 years old this year, kind of a part of the entire UN system. And you talked about sort of our work in supporting food security and nutrition. Specifically, we work in a number of areas related to what are called the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has as a part of an agenda that we're working towards getting to improvements in global society by 2030. And there are 17 of those Sustainable Development Goals for the entire UN system. And FAO is really sort of the custodian or really sort of in charge of 5 of them. And those 5 are getting us to zero hunger, working on gender equality, clean water and sanitation, responsible consumption and production, food and agriculture, and what we say life below water, sort of fisheries and aquaculture and water natural resource protection, and life on land. And in many ways, if I were to list the other 12 sustainable development goals for you, you could probably quickly recognize that we also actually do touch and contribute to really all of them. I mean, that's the nature of food and agriculture. I think you well appreciate that. So it's a big task. And in many ways, what I'm doing now is trying to take in some small ways the Indiana and the AgriNovus sort of playbook and kind of bring it to a global stage where you're really, again, working to improve livelihoods, to support young people, support women, support rural communities, but all towards also this effort to basically end hunger and reduce poverty. Our agency is really quite large. We stand at about 13,000 people. We have a presence in over 130 countries. We're headquartered in Rome. We have about 3,000 people here in our headquarters, very near the city center of Rome. And we are made up of 194 member countries, members. So the US and the European Union and developed countries are all part of our organizational governance structure, but as are all of the representatives from so many of the developing world regions as well. Yeah. They really are sort of our, what I would call, board of directors. People that we report to, and the work that we do is really also very much driven by these political and governmental leaders, ambassadors and permanent representatives from all over the world. They are an important source of knowledge, an important source of encouragement for us. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the work that FAO does really sort of centers around sort of 3 buckets of work. We are known as a knowledge center, so the economic analysis analysis, the data, the policy information that we put out about the state of the world in food and agriculture today is, I think, very much recognized by everyone in the food and agricultural system. But we also then support technical work at the country level. So alongside organizations like USAID, other non-governmental organization partners, the World Food Program, and so many others, when there's either emergency, humanitarian, or even development-related work that needs to happen in a country, FAO, given our country footprint and country presence, is often many times involved in that as well. So it's a big mission, a big mandate, but with clearly a lot of resources and a lot of opportunities to really contribute at the country and the regional level, which I think is one of the most important assets that we have here, alongside with just the outstanding technical expertise, the scientific expertise, the economic expertise that we have here. I have a very smart, very amazing group of colleagues that I have, not had the luxury to get to know very well because we've all been in lockdown, but they are an incredible group of people who are a part of this organization, all working towards this very important mission.
Yeah, and what a great mission! Such important work. I know you gotta feel good about what you're doing. And something that we've often said here on the podcast is food security is national security. We said it a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic, and just listening to you talk, food security is human security. I mean, it's so much more than national security. So let's talk a little bit more about food insecurity and the current state at the global scale. I mean, are we becoming a more food secure or food insecure world?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, our most recent numbers from the last few years are not going in the direction that we'd like to see them. So after about 20 years of a somewhat steady decrease that we've been seeing in food insecurity, chronic hunger, and malnutrition, these trends have unfortunately started to flatten, and in some regions of the world have actually reversed in the last few years. We have more than 820 million people today who are what we call chronically undernourished, while a total lorry of about 2 billion people in the world experience sort of a next level moderate or severe food insecurity. So between hunger and then food accessibility, food availability, our situation globally is not a good one.
Right.
And, it's a lot of, there's a lot of reasons for these changes before we even get to a conversation that I'm sure we'll have around COVID and the impact that it's having. But if you think just about the world as we know it today, you have an increasing number of conflicts. Political conflicts. You sort of mentioned, national security, global issues that are emerging, geopolitical forces at work. And when conflict comes in a country, oftentimes availability or accessibility for the most vulnerable of people in a region or a country, it becomes a challenge. On top of that, we've got challenging economic times in certain countries around the world that just exacerbates that food insecurity as well. And believe, or don't believe, but I would argue, whether you want to call it climate change or global warming or whatever the terminology is, there are definite changes in climate today that are changing agricultural productivity patterns and affecting profitability, affecting productivity, affecting yields, affecting the ability to maintain certain cropping or livestock, animal-related systems. And that too is contributing to this increase in food insecurity. But, interestingly, and I think, you probably have covered this on your podcast as well, we also, this is the juxtaposition, right? While we've got these trends in food insecurity, we're also seeing quite alarming trends in what we say, maybe a little more politely as overnutrition, right? So overweight, obesity levels increasing at an alarming rate, not just in the developed world, but this is also occurring in the developing countries as well. And so it's this really challenging time that in the same countries, you may be battling food insecurity on one hand and overweight and obesity all at the same time. And so for us, we have to not only think about sort of the promotion of zero hunger, but at the same time making sure that we don't leave off healthy diets, nutrition, and more sustainable ways of agricultural production in those conversations as well.
Yes, so important. So let's go ahead and talk about the last 3 to 4 months since the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how that has affected food insecurity.
Yeah, it's been nothing short of disheartening in so many ways to see what has been happening around the world. The evolution of COVID, its tail, as you might say, of sort of starting in certain parts of the world, and now as we watch in the Southern Hemisphere, South and Central America, Africa, the Middle East. It's, while we might see here in Italy or even in the United States, some relaxing and people getting back to a bit of normalcy, these other parts of the world that are already suffering from, whether it was food insecurity or some of these other trends that I mentioned, to have COVID still be such a challenge there gives us great pause in terms of not only the crisis that we're currently, I think, experiencing in these places, but also the what you might say medium to long-term implications of what it will mean for those countries. So, it's really exacerbated this situation that we find with probably as many as 120 million people in addition to those already at risk that are now sort of on the verge of being put into a chronic hunger or food insecure system, all because we're seeing disruption of supply chains. But I think back to my point about the more, sort of medium to long term, what we also are recognizing is going to happen is we're going to have a very severe economic impact for the next few years globally as a result of this pandemic, with a recession I know that will be triggered in many parts of the world. And so not only do you have the the challenge of lockdowns and other restrictions, production aspects and challenges that different countries are facing, but play this out a little bit longer, and next thing you know, we'll be seeing rapid increases in unemployment, perhaps even going to 300 million people worldwide. You'll see the loss of just livelihoods for hundreds of millions of people. And when that happens, right, just play the system out, when jobs are lost, livelihoods are struggling, we'll see increases in hunger and poverty. And for us, one particular area that we think probably doesn't get as much notice as maybe other regions, but are many of the small island countries, whether they're in the Caribbean, Latin America, or even in parts of Asia. These were countries that were almost entirely dependent on imports of food with no agricultural production in their countries.
and an economy rooted in tourism, right?
Absolutely. That was exactly what I was going to say next. I mean, where you see 80 and 90% levels of economic activity driven by tourism or remittances that their citizens who are working in other parts of the world send back to their families, right? That sort of income transfer because somebody else is working in another part of the world. And so all of that has been already impacted by COVID restrictions and the global economic downturn. So COVID is going to be a very significant contributor to, unfortunately, these less than positive trends that we're seeing. And now what many of us are having to do is begin to turn our focus from just an emergency and a humanitarian response where you're trying to deal with the immediate, making sure that people just have access to food. Now we're trying to move towards more of the 2-year, 3-year, 5-year. How do you make sure that value chains are sustained, that, you know, workers are protected, that rural communities remain vibrant? And it's what we call sort of the development and the resiliency plan for many of these countries. And that's where FAO has, I think, really an opportunity to come alongside private sector partners, other NGOs, and really work to try to make as sustainable of these systems as we possibly can.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I probably haven't given that enough thought yet. You know, I mean, you mentioned the getting food in the hands of people, you know, and the short term, like during the pandemic, we saw that here in the US. I mean, the schools, they were the hub. I just listened to the school food service director for Palm Springs Unified School District, 25,000 students, most of which have families that are employed in the tourism industry within Palm Desert, California. And they were serving up to 30,000 meals a day. You know, they turned their school and their school cafeteria turned into, a feeding hub for their community. And, it's great that in certain parts of the world, that kind of triage response was available. A ton of these countries that that your organization touches. I mean, that kind of federal response and program and infrastructure doesn't exist. And so, and even here in the US, you know, it's like, wow, that was a triage response or a short-term solution. But I probably, until you just said that, I probably haven't given enough thought to like, what's 3 years? So I'm glad you're working on it, because it is, my goodness, what an important thing to bring up. And thank you for bringing that up and for working on it.
Well, thanks for mentioning it, because what I also am realizing is that unfortunately right now, I think for all of us as a society, we have pretty limited attention spans today. And that's the part that does really concern me about the work that we do. You know, there's other great UN related organizations like the World Food Program and UNICEF and others who are very much about sort of in the moment, very social media active, you know, getting people to draw their attention to the plight of either children or, again, people who are hungry. And you know, we are a very philanthropic society, I think, still today, and people want to give and people want to do it sort of with some immediate gratification. And one of the things that I'm recognizing that's going to be, I think, a challenge for FAO is that we're in it for the long haul. And sometimes it's hard to keep people's attention on a problem, on a crisis, when, you know, 2 years from now, we have a COVID vaccine and maybe our comfort level is all back up a little bit again, back to some kind of normalcy. The foundational structural changes that this pandemic, though, will have left in so many parts of the world will have to be fixed and worked on for a long period of time. And I do just very personally get concerned that, you know, there's going to have to be a lot of us who continue to grab a lot of your listeners and other people by the shoulders and say, but it's not fixed yet. And we still need you, and we still need support. We still need attention. And that's a challenge today in this, again, sort of short attention span, go take care of a problem, solve it, move on to the next one. This is very foundational and will require a lot of time and attention and resources.
Right. And as you speak about, you know, being, you know, foundational efforts that you're doing, and previously you mentioned FAO is known as a knowledge center. So what would you say, in all that you know and all that you offer as the Deputy Director General of FAO, what would you say is the root cause of food insecurity?
Well, I think I'll probably, to answer that, sort of go back to a few of the points that I may have made earlier. But, you know, as we really sort of take on the assignment of sort of assessing what we say is the state of food insecurity in the world. We actually have a flagship publication that we release every year along with 4 partner agencies. This particular report is called the SOFI report, SOFI, State of Food Insecurity. We really do sort of look at kind of 4 underlying trends as it relates to, just as you asked, the kind of cause of hunger. And it's inequality, protracted crises, climate change, and economic slowdowns. These, unfortunately, though, in many parts of the world, don't happen in isolation of one another. Right. Oftentimes, you will find challenges in a particular country where you might even find all 4 of those problems impacting a population. And inequality, right, is unfortunately increasing in many parts of the world. We talk about that in the United States, lower incomes, purchasing power, families having to reduce budgets for food and food availability. We also pay a lot of attention to the impact of the status of women and gender as it relates to food insecurity. Women face disproportionately higher risks of food insecurity around the world compared to men. And you know well the status of gender inequality in many parts of the world where there's either a lack of education, lack of opportunities, access to different services to provide for food and to support families. I talked about climate change. That concerns us as we think about, again, productivity of agriculture and sometimes, unfortunately, creating competition for already scarce resources. And just disappointingly, I think, again, what we all see as we watch sort of the geopolitical forces at work, just the number of conflicts in this world is on the rise. And that's exacerbated by economic challenges, by climate-related shocks. And these are definitely causing serious impacts on food security. And when these conflicts are prolonged, that only serves to exacerbate the problem. Institutions and governments and educational systems all are weakened when you have existing conflict in certain countries. Think Yemen, for example. It's hard to imagine how those kinds of places in the world are able to sort of get themselves out of that cycle of conflict that leads to poverty, that then leads to food insecurity, that then leads to more conflict.
Yes.
So it's the challenge is that so much of it is out of our control as FAO. So we have to try to work inside sort of those challenging environments to try to get either the necessary, again, emergency support and be able to go in and build some of these places back better.
Yeah. Oh, I know. It pulls at the heartstrings hearing you talk about all that because it's so real. And I think for a lot of folks, it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind type of topic, and that also comes back to what you were saying with, we've got to focus on the foundational issues here, not these triage. I mean, the triage things are obviously also critical, but, it's just, I don't know. It's complicated. It's emotional. And it's sad, but also what you're doing is so important. And that brings such a ray of light and hope to the world. And so, I mean, you've called out certain countries as you've been talking. You've mentioned, obviously, the gender inequalities and how females are more susceptible to hunger. Are there any other stats that you can share about, who is suffering from hunger?
Yeah, so first I might start to answer that maybe with a bit of sort of geographic distribution. So chronic hunger, as we look at those populations and the numbers that I mentioned earlier, is really mainly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia. So when we think geographically, and we have to think about what parts of the world to really be engaged and to target our resources, that's really where I think we and other organizations are focusing. Unfortunately, hunger is on the rise in almost all of the African subregions, making it really the region with the highest prevalence of undernourishment or food insecurity at almost 20% of the entire continent's population suffering in that way. But it's slowly rising in Latin America and the Caribbean, and again, Western Asia, South Asia. We're seeing prevalence there. And so what we're also finding, if you think about, the world, the globe, we're beginning to also sort of move into this north-south hemispheric sort of divide with, as you think about those regions of the world being in the southern hemisphere, we're really starting to see kind of the north as the developed world and the south as the developing world. And
interesting.
That too is,
yeah.
I think, something that we all need to be mindful of. But I think the other point that I would make is that almost paradoxically, when you ask sort of who's suffering from hunger, some of the smallest scale farmers and food producers who actually produce almost 80% of the food consumed worldwide are the ones more likely to suffer from hunger in their own countries and in their own regions or communities. And most of that's because lack of other economic driven opportunities, social protection problems. They don't have access to all of the right productivity resources and services, and just lower chances to actually get access to local, national, or even global markets. And so, that's the part that, again, with a farm background, to think about these farmers who are committed to growing crops, growing animals, taking care of their own families, trying to earn a living, trying to make a contribution perhaps even to their community, oftentimes can still be considered the poorest of the poor, and also be afflicted by hunger as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, one thing we always advocate for is growers, farmers, ranchers. I mean, they need higher returns.
Right.
But at the same time, I mean, talk about, the paradox. At the same time, you're going to raise the price of food, it's really, I don't know. I keep saying the word complicated because I just don't have a better adjective, but, so do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's a complicated one. You're exactly right. I mean, in theory, wearing, my economics, agricultural economics hat, I mean, the data would show, the theory would show you that rising food prices present an opportunity for farmers to increase production, to invest, to increase their productivity, to ultimately increase their incomes. But that's in theory. In the real world, it sort of depends, right? Rising food prices doesn't always mean or translate into income profit generation for farmers or producers, whether you're in the United States or whether you're in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, and part of the problem that we face is that obviously farmers and producers from one state to another, one country to another are very different. Some have greater access to labor and capital. Others have better access to markets. In some places we see, very little access to financial tools and to credit, and where those are all of the kinds of externalities that if you have all of that available, you usually can benefit from higher food prices. But unfortunately, those types of assets oftentimes in the developing world aren't available to the smaller scale farmers that are there. But the other thing, unfortunately, that we're finding, especially in the context of COVID, is that rising food prices really are often serving as, or learning, are actually a consequence of market closures. So governments that closing down markets, trying to make sure in sort of a knee-jerk kind of reaction that they keep food supplies, food stocks in their own country, as opposed to letting them go out into the market. And so that creates then an inability of farmers to be able to market their goods or their products through, different harvest cycles. And then this can result in either food shortages and then rising prices. So it's a complicated sort of question. And again, I think I come back to I think it sort of depends on the foundational economic underpinnings of circumstances by which we get to that place of increased prices and whether any producers can ultimately benefit from that or not.
Agreed. So where do we go from here, Beth? I mean, where do consumers go? People who are employed in the agriculture supply chain, no matter where they're at in the world, what can we do to improve the current state of global food security?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that I would say, and I believe in this, obviously, given the role that I've just taken on, and I believed it before I came here, but we are a global economy and we are global citizens. And this is not intended to be a political statement, but now is not the time for us to be thinking only in a nationalistic lens or through only a nationalistic lens. This is probably one of, I would argue, especially through a food and agricultural prism, that it's one of the most important times that we maintain a focus on globalism.
Yeah.
And we maintain a commitment to multilateralism and to working together. Now, everybody out there, every U.S. and other contributing country member to and tax-paying citizen who is a part of FAO or a part of the UN should hold organizations like us accountable to make sure that we're doing the best with the resources that we have from our member governments and the other partners that we receive resources and support from. But now is not the time, either in the US or in any other part of the developed world, to sort of give up on the people who are so in need today.
Yeah.
And that's probably the first thing that I would say. I think the second thing that I would offer is, I mentioned it earlier, but I just would repeat it. We're going to need a lot of people to recognize that there aren't going to be quick fixes and quick wins in this battle. This is a long game. And so we need attention, we need partnerships, we need innovation, we need entrepreneurs and creativity, we need partners of all shapes and sizes to sort of stick with this agenda and stick with this battle with us. Back to my earlier comments about sort of not losing sight of the longer term implications and only focusing on sort of the immediate tied to COVID. And, when life gets back to normal, life may get a little bit back to normal in some places, but there's a lot of sort of underpinning foundational disruption that's taking place in a lot of other parts of the world that is going to require a lot of resources, a lot of know-how, a lot of technical support, and we're going to need a lot of partners to come alongside us to make sure that we continue to support those countries and support those individuals who are most in need. So there's a lot of ways to connect. We at FAO are looking and exploring all new kinds of creative ways that we can partner with private sector, with university, with NGOs. We're opening the door to new and different kinds of agricultural innovation. I'm bringing, again, my AgriNovus commitment to next generation talent and the support of startups and entrepreneurs to help us think creatively about how we make an impact in all of these places. And it's going to take all of us to do that. And I hope that you can continue to get this message out to all of the people who listen to your podcast and that you touch, because it's going to take every one of us to get these trends going back in the right direction and make an improvement in so many people's lives around the world.
Thank you. What amazing closing thoughts, Beth. I mean, I couldn't say it. I couldn't say anything better than that. So I'm just going to say thank you. And I'm so glad that you came back on. Truly enjoyed our time together on this episode. And I know everyone who listened did too. We all learned a lot. So with that, Beth, you do get the final goodbye. You know that from being a previous guest, but my goodness, you keep moving those mountains. We need people like you. And thank you for all that you do. And thank you for your time today.
Well, I want to say thank you, Lori. You have been so inspiring to me to see how you bring attention to so many important topics through your voice and through the people that you have such real and very genuine conversations with. And the fact that I've gotten to do two, talking about my passion for AgTech and for young people and for the next generation, and now bridging that to this bigger sort of global call to action, you're to be commended for bringing the kind of very real, very committed attention to some of these really big topics that food and agriculture, all of us involved in food and agriculture, need to be thinking about, need to be working on together. So it's been a real pleasure once again, and I am going to take you up on the offer to get you here to Rome, and maybe open sometime we can go to a pizzeria or some really amazing place here, because
that's right.
Pretty amazing city and a lot of great work is done here, and it would be great to have you come visit sometime.
I look forward to it. We're definitely doing it.
Perfect.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Produce Moms Podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a featured guest, just send an email to lori@theproducemoms.com. We know there is a produce mom in you because there's a produce mom in all of us. Join our community on Facebook and all social platforms. Help us change the way America eats. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.